what you're about to hear tonight. So, Dr.
Thank you.
Avital, hello.
Hello.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and where you're from?
I was born in Czechoslovakia, a town called Bilka. There were 2,000 Jews, 8,000 non-Jews. We lived a tranquil life because the Czechs were a liberal people. Not only did they not bother the Jews, on the contrary, they were very friendly, especially the first president of Czechoslovakia, Dr. Thomas Masaryk, who was a real Zionist. He went to Palestine in the 1930s. He was for a Jewish state then, and Jews from Czechoslovakia established a kibbutz in Israel called Kfar Masaryk. And when he became old and he was saying goodbye to the presidency, he went from synagogue to synagogue to say goodbye, and it was during Hanukkah. And he saw the Jews lighting the Hanukkah candles, and he said, you know, you are lighting the 8 candles, and you also have the shamash, the servant that lights the other candles. The Jewish people are like the shamash. You light the lights of the other nations. That's what the Jewish people are.
And how many children were you in your family?
We were 11 children. I was the youngest.
And you're the cutie on the left, right?
Yes, this is me when I was 11 years old. I was a happy child. It wasn't an easy life because in those days it was not as developed as we have here in America, but we were very happy. Our daily life was as follows. At 5 o'clock in the morning, we woke up to go to Cheder, to the Jewish school, until 8:30 in the morning. At 8:30, we went to public school, to Czech public school, because everybody had to go to public school. If not, the parents went to jail. Until 3:30 in the afternoon. At 3:30, we went back to Cheder and stayed there until 8 o'clock in the evening. At 8 o'clock in the evening, we went home, we ate supper, and we made homework for the public school, not for the Jewish school because they did not give us homework. That was our daily life, and we did not complain. And vacation in the summer was not 2.5 months, it was only 1 month.
And you had chores also, because in addition to all of this, there was
Right.
no running water in your house, right?
There was no running water, there was no electricity, and every child, not only in our family, had their chores. We had to bring water from the well, we had to bring water from the river for washing, we had to chop wood, we had to do all kinds of things, and that's how the family was functioning.
Tell me a little bit about your parents. You had very special parents as well, right?
Yes, my father, alav shalom, came from a line of rabbis and shochatim. He was born in Poland, and when he was 5 years old, his family moved to Czechoslovakia. My mother also came from very distinguished rabbis, and she was born in Czechoslovakia, and so all of us 11 were born in Czechoslovakia.
And you used to sing with your father as well, right?
Yes, my father wrote books. He was a cantor also, and the community loved him. He served for 40 years until we were taken to the Ghetto and then to Auschwitz.
Tell me a little bit about Zionism and how you're a big supporter of Israel. You were there at the state's inception. Where did that come from? Because if you grew up rabbinic, Zionism wasn't always something that was completely part of the culture.
We actually got our Zionism from our learning the Chumash, the Bible, because when we learned about Kever Rachel, the tomb of Rachel, we learned the history about Israel. Or if we learned about the Ma'arat Machpelah, the cave of Machpelah, we learned about the forefathers who was buried there, and that Abraham bought it. And we learned about Jacob and his sons. So all this made us aware that we belong there. Although some of the very, very extreme religious leadership was against Zionism, the average people were very much for it.
And they had little
Yes, we used to have all kinds of youth movements. Mm-hmm. For instance, my brothers and I belonged to B'nai Akiva before the war.
Like this.
Right. Mm-hmm. And there we learned some Hebrew. We learned about Israel. We learned Hebrew songs. And we had a club that we used to go there every Shabbat and holidays. And that's where we studied and we prayed.
Beautiful. Now, I'm going to skip ahead because there's so much to talk about and bring us up to 1939. Another thing that I love about telling these stories is it really forces me not only to learn current geography, but to delve into the confusing world of countries that existed and stopped existing during World War II. Czechoslovakia was just such a country. If you look on the map now, you're not going to find a country that looks like this. The Germans did, Kristallnacht happened at the end of 1938 in November. And in March, just a couple of months later, Germans began to take over various parts of Europe. One of the ways they bought favor from various countries, you can take over a country one of many ways. One is to storm, and the other way is to buy favor. They took Czechoslovakia, which was a more progressive country at the time, and dissolved it. And they gave pieces of the country to the countries that were around it. And this is relevant, and I bring it up because I find for myself sometimes with stories, you hear about, and these people came in, and it's the Hungarians and the Poles, and it gets confusing. So I'm sharing this with everybody so that we can understand a little bit about what happens next. 1939, Germans come, they take apart, they dissolve Czechoslovakia, they give pieces of Czechoslovakia to the Hungarians. The Hungarians were not nearly as progressive as the Czechs, and there was a lot more latent and not so latent anti-Semitism amongst them. Bilka, which is right over there with the yellow arrow, is where Dr. Avital's family was from. And once the Hungarians came in and took over, they were required to change schools. There was a lot more aggression towards Jews. And if he was to pinpoint a time when things started to shift, that would be the time. Dr. Avital, can you tell us a little bit about what happened to your father and why he had to go into hiding once the Hungarians came in and took over?
When the Hungarians came into the Carpathians, where I come from, which was eastern Czechoslovakia, they demanded that everybody should prove their citizenship, that they belonged to that area. Since my father was born in Poland, he could not prove that he was a Czech citizen because he never bothered to take out Czech citizenship because the Czechs were liberal people and they didn't bother the Jews. So since my mother and all of the 11 children were born in Czechoslovakia, we changed our name from our father's last name to our mother's maiden name, so we were able to prove that we are citizens of that area. However, our father could not prove that, so he went into hiding. But later on, it didn't make any difference. They took all the Jews, regardless whether they had papers or not.
What happened to somebody if they were caught and they couldn't prove their
There
citizenship?
were 20,000 Jews in the Carpathians that couldn't prove their citizenship, and they were deported to the Ukraine, to Kamenets-Podolsk, and there on Tisha B'Av in 1941, they were all massacred and buried in mass graves.
And you had two brothers that were brought to labor camp as well, right?
Yes, all the males, 18 to 50, were recruited to the Munkotabor, what the Hungarians called, which were the forced labor battalions. 3 of my brothers were in those camps. 2 of them perished in those camps.
Tell me a little bit about how school changed. Once the Hungarians came in, you had to change schools. And there were moments that stand out to you as particularly difficult.
There were 2 public school systems in Czechoslovakia. There were the Czech public school, and other minorities had autonomy that they had their own public school system. So in Bilka, in our town, there were 2 systems, the Czech public school and the Ukrainian public school. Most of the Jews, practically all, went to the Czech public school. The non-Jews went to the Ukrainian public school. When the Czechs left and the Hungarians took over, there was no more Czech public school, and the Hungarians established a Hungarian public school plus the Ukrainian public school. Since the Jews did not know Hungarian, and also many of them didn't like the Hungarians because they were a bunch of fascists, they preferred to go to the Ukrainian. And also the language. The language was very close from Czech to Ukrainian, so it was easier, the transition, to go to that school. However, when we arrived at the Ukrainian public school, there was a lot of anti-Semitism. And since I had peyot, before I used to go to school, I used to put them behind my ears.
These are the long locks that,
Right.
that boys would have, right?
Not only me, but all the Jewish boys. I was sitting with another friend on the same bench, also called Moshe, and 2 non-Jewish boys were sitting in the back of us and the bench there. In the middle of the lesson, they started to pull our peyot, and it bothered us terribly, and we hated what they did. And when we went out for recess, we beat them up, but good. And they were crying. And they went to the teacher in complaint. And the teacher called us and put us in front of the class and yelled at us, and they said that they're going to call our parents. They sent for my father. My father came, and the teacher told him what I did, and without asking me what happened, he gave me 2 smacks in front of the entire class. I was very hurt. Both it hurt, but even more that the dignity of the Jew was hurt. So when I came home, I was crying and telling my father, I was protecting the honor of the Jews, and you come and you hit me. So my father said, you have to understand, we are in Galut, we are in exile, and we have to lower ourselves until the bad times will pass. I'm sorry what I did. And for a month, I didn't want to go back to school. However, after a month, I had to, because otherwise my parents would have gone to jail. So I went back to school. However, soon after that, we were all chased out from the schools because Jews were not allowed to continue their education.
So let's talk about that. If we move forward in time a little bit, now there comes a point where Jews are not allowed to own property, they're not allowed to go to work anymore, food is being rationed, it's hard to get food, you're not in school, you have to be careful of people on the street, people are being sent to labor camps, and in other parts of Europe, concentration camps are already existing. Did you know, was there any sense from your community that this was going on elsewhere?
We really didn't know much because as soon as the Hungarians entered our town, they confiscated all the radios. They even, because they were, in a way, they were kind of stupid. They even took apart the roof. You know what an roof is that you do around the community so you are able to carry on Shabbat. They took it apart because they thought that it was a secret Jewish radio. So we didn't have much news. However, we didn't know that there were concentration camps. We knew that in Poland and the Ukraine, they are killing Jews, that the local anti-Semites are helping the Germans killing Jews. But we found out when the Jews were taken to Kamenets-Podolsk, an uncle of mine, my father's brother, and 8 of their children were also taken to that place, and they were massacred. The 2 older boys, 17 and 19, while they were shooting at them, escaped, and they came to our house, and they told us what happened. So we knew that they have been killing, but we didn't know about concentration camps.
Right. And at some point, things shift. Small towns were liquidated. Jews were no longer allowed to live in their homes. They were moved. In the bigger war machine effort, smaller towns were liquidated and brought to ghettos. Ghettos were generally places where they would take Jews from many small towns and congregate them in one place until the government could figure out what would happen next. Sometimes, like in Poland, you could be in a ghetto for years, and other times, like in Dr. Moshe's case, you could be there for just a few weeks. Dr. Avital, can you tell us about what happened when you and your family and your town was told to leave? It was Passover, right? It was
Right.
Literally this time of year, 1944.
It was the last day of Passover. The police informed us that the next morning we have to leave Bilka and we are being taken to a ghetto, and that we are allowed to take with us only 25 pounds per person. The next morning, the police showed up at the Jewish homes, and they sealed up the homes, and they sent us to the yard of the main synagogue. There were police and Hungarian soldiers standing guard with their bayonets, and they had a list of the entire community, and they called out family by family, and they lined us up, and we marched to the train. It took quite a long time because it was a distance from the shul to the train. When we arrived at the train, we saw that there was a train of boxcars. These were cattle cars. And they pushed us in, 100 people, into this boxcar. The local people, who some of them were great anti-Semites, were helping the police to push us in because they wanted to get rid of us as soon as possible so they can pillage the Jewish homes and take everything.
Now, you even mentioned that it's well known that Germans didn't discriminate. If you had parents, one of whom was Jewish and one of whom was not, didn't matter. Children are Jewish, mother is Jewish. Sometimes even the father would get punished for being married to a Jew. There was a woman in your town who married a non-Jew, and wasn't common in those days to do that. She eventually showed up at the ghetto as well.
Right.
What did she say?
What happened was that the Jewish community in Bilka existed for 300 years. There was only one case of intermarriage, and this was a Jewish girl who fell in love with a non-Jewish boy because the family was living on the outskirts of Bilka, and she married him. The parents were against it. They even sit shiva after her. That's how it was in those days. And this woman had 3 boys, and when all the Jews of Bilka were taken to the ghetto, she stayed in Bilka with her husband and the 3 boys. However, 2 weeks before we were taken to Auschwitz, suddenly she was brought with the police to the ghetto, the 3 boys and herself, and she told us that her husband didn't want to save her, that he said, I want to get rid of these Jews. And that's what happened.
In the ghetto, once you were there, it was a structure without walls. People didn't really have any privacy. Were people kind to one another? Was there still a sense of humanity, even in these inhumane conditions?
While we were together as a community, there was kindness, there were helping one another, even in the train when we were sent to Auschwitz. But when we arrived in Auschwitz and we were mixed up with other groups and you didn't know the prisoners, things changed. Yeah. Because there were some people who became very selfish. They wanted to save themselves. Some of them became kapos, not many, a few. And also we know that some of the Jews were Judenrat, and that's what happened. But in general, Jews were helping one another, as it says, Kol Yisrael arevim ze lazeh. Every Jew is responsible for one another.
And in the ghetto as well, most of the Jews were told that they had to shave their beards or they would get cut off. Your father was a very dignified rabbi, and he defied the Hungarians and the Germans, didn't he? What did he do?
They ordered that all the men had to shave their beards. The only 2 that did not shave their beards from our town was my father, alav shalom, and the rabbi of our town. They put on some kind of a kerchief which covered it up. And when they arrived in Auschwitz, pictures were taken of them to show what a Jew looked like. I don't know if you are familiar, there's an album called the Auschwitz album, and in there are 200 pictures of a transport that arrived in Auschwitz, and this was the transport that came, and I recognized the rabbi of Bilka. I didn't see my father in it, but that's what happened.
So let's talk about the transition from the ghetto to Auschwitz. You were only in the ghetto for a couple of weeks.
6 weeks.
And at this point, who are you with? You have lost 2 brothers already. Your uncle and his family were lost, but you were with your father and your mother, your sisters, their children,
right,
and your brothers, except for the one there was one that went to Israel before the war. When you got on the boxcar, were you allowed to travel together, or did they separate you?
When we were loaded in Ghetto Barrack on the way to Auschwitz, they allowed families to go on. So we were together yet. Yeah. And it's interesting that in the boxcar, my father made 2 statements, very important statements, with the landslide, the people from our town that were in the wagon. One of them, he said, as soon as Roosevelt will find out what's happening, he is going to stop it. Now that's how much the Jews believed in Roosevelt, not only in America, even in Europe. He was an idol for the Jews, but they were terribly mistaken because all of us know what happened to the St. Louis that was right here near the Statue of Liberty, and they were not allowed to be brought in, and instead they were sent back to Europe. Most of them were sent to concentration camps, and many of them perished. The other statement that he made, I had a brother who was a yeshiva bachur, a student, a yeshiva student, who studied for 5 years after bar mitzvah in the big yeshivot in Slovakia. And not only that brother, all my brothers. However, he became a Zionist. And one day he decided that he is making aliyah. My family was against it, especially my mother. She was worried about him. She said, where are you going, in a desert where the Arabs are killing Jews? Already then, the Arabs were killing Jews. But he didn't listen, and he left in 1937. My father was also against it. In the wagon to Auschwitz, my father said, I had 11 children. One of them was smart.
How many days were you in the boxcar?
5 days.
Did they give you water?
They put in each boxcar 2 containers. 1 container of water and 1 container for human waste. After 1 day, the water was gone and the container with human waste was overflowing. You have to imagine what it means that 100 people are close together. You could not sit, you could not lie down, you were standing like sardines. And if people had to go, at first, people didn't know what to do, they were ashamed. So people were standing around, males were standing around when somebody had to go, and women were standing around, and that's how it was. After a couple of days, elderly and children were dying because of hunger. We didn't have anything to eat. And you will be surprised how much a person can endure, how much you can suffer and still stay alive.
When you got to Auschwitz, the doors opened, and you see this sign, Auschwitz. Was it familiar to you? Had you heard about it? At this point, did you know that? Did you have any idea where you were?
No, as a matter of fact, every time that the train stopped on the way to Auschwitz, there were people in the boxcar that were looking out. There was an opening on top near the roof, which was secured with barbed wire. They were looking out, what is the name of the station? When we arrived in Auschwitz, they looked out and they saw a name, Auschwitz, which they never heard of, and they asked around in the wagon, and nobody heard of that name. And soon after that, the doors opened up, and the SS, with ferocious dogs, were chasing us out from these cars. Now, these cars were very high, and there were no steps. So it took a long time for the elderly and the children to come off. And if they didn't hurry, the Germans were clubbing them with clubs, and they were yelling in German, raus, raus, out, out, schnell, schnell, fast, fast. And many were hurt terribly. And they yelled that we should line up, women in one column with children, and another column the man.
Who is this gentleman over here? You met him, didn't you?
Yeah, this is Mengele. This is Dr. Josef Mengele, the doctor who made the selection of who is going to live in the meantime, and that will go to slave labor, and who is going to go to the gas chambers. At that time when we arrived, we didn't know what it meant, left or right. Only a few days later, we found out what it really meant.
What does left and right mean?
Left meant that they were taken right away to the gas chambers, and right meant that you went to slave labor.
And what happened to your family?
My mother, the 5 sisters, and the 6 grandchildren, they all went with the women. They disappeared. I didn't have even time to say goodbye. We didn't know where they went or what happened. Then my father and my brother Joseph, who was 17, and I, who was 14, were now in line to stand in front of Mengele. When my father was in front of him, he motioned with his finger to go to the left. And my brother Joseph, he motioned to the right. And when I stood in front of Mengele, he hesitated for a moment what to do with me. And finally, he motioned I should go to the right. I ran over to my brother. Now, I don't know why he sent me to the right, because some of my friends who were my age, whom I had as friends in Cheder and in public school, he sent to the left, and me he sent to the right. I only attributed that to zchut avot, to the merits of my ancestors.
How long were you in Auschwitz for? Not that long, right? Some people are there for a very long time.
We were, my brother and I were in Auschwitz for 6 weeks, and then one day, the entire barrack, 1,000 people, we were taken to Plaszow. That's the concentration camp where the Schindler's List takes place. Some of you might have seen the movie Schindler's List. This was a camp that was built on the cemetery of the city of Krakow, of the Jewish cemetery. And there was a commandant who was a ferocious Nazi. He had a villa on top of the hill, and if he saw prisoners just walking in camp, not running, he shot them from his window.
What was the difference between Auschwitz and Plaszow? In Auschwitz, you did hard labor. You worked every day. You slept in a barrack with 1,000 other people. When you were switched to Plaszow, was it the same sort of work?
Every camp was very similar. It was surrounded by the double barbed wire, and one fence was electrified. It had the same guard posts. Very much. The diet was the same. The work sometimes was different. In our case, my brother learned from my sister how to sew on a machine. And when we came to Plaszow, they asked each one of us, "What is your profession?" When I stood in front of the assessment, when he asked me, "What is your profession?" I said, "I'm a student," because I never had a profession. So they marked me down for regular labor. My brother said that he is a tailor. So they marked him down to be a tailor, because in Plaszow, they had factories where they made for the German army the uniforms. So he went to work in the tailor shop, and I marched out every morning, 8 kilometers, to the train station of Krakow, where we loaded and unloaded heavy equipment for the German army that was sent to the Russian front.
And how did they treat were the laborers treated any better or worse than anybody else?
No, it was the same. If you didn't keep up fast, or if you walked out of the line, or if you didn't obey they beat you, they punish you, and so on.
And after you were in Plaszow, then you've moved to even yet another camp. Right? You went to Gross Rosa.
Now, we had twice a day, we had roll call. And we made sure, my brother and I, that every time there is roll call, we lined up in the same row of 5. Because we heard that sometimes family is separated. And we did this for 4 months while we were in Plaszow. We were sleeping in the same barrack. In the middle of the night, they woke us up. The couples were hitting us to rush out. And in the confusion, this time, we did not line up in the same row of 5. My brother was just a few rows away. And an SS man came and he started to count. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, above face. They took us to the train station, and my brother remained with the rest of the group in Plaszow, and that was the last time I saw him. And I was sent to Gross Rosen.
Now, your brother, you found out later, was in the infirmary.
Right.
And you mentioned the irony of the fact that in the camp, to land up in the infirmary, any place else, if you land up in the infirmary, that's where you go to get better. But in the infirmary your brother was, that's where they injected people's hearts with gasoline to finish them.
You know, in any civilized country, when a person goes to an infirmary, he goes there to be healed, to become better. Once you entered into the infirmary in any of the camps, your life was ended because they injected gasoline into the heart of the sick person, and that's how they killed him. My brother, I didn't know what happened to him after I was taken from Plaszow. In Buchenwald, when I arrived in the 6th camp, later on, just 2 weeks before liberation, I found a boy from my hometown who was also in Plaszow with us. And I said to him, Mandy, what happened to my brother? He said, unfortunately, in December of 1944, he entered the infirmary and he never came out. That's the only thing I know.
Gross Rosen, you said, was a bad camp.
Yes.
I don't really think any of them were particularly good camps, but...
No, but this camp specifically was a transition camp. And everything that you did, you had to do on the double. If you didn't run, the couples, there were a lot of couples there, they were beating you up. So from that point of view, it was worse than some of the others.
Right. You also mentioned that this was the camp that you would see people who just couldn't handle it anymore and would run into the electrical fences and commit suicide.
Well, what happened was there were some people that were waiting every day, maybe we will be liberated, and some people had faith, especially people that came from religious homes, had something to hold on because they believed in God and they felt that something will happen and the Jewish people will not be extinguished because we were promised that the Jewish people is an eternal people. So, but there were some that after a while, they couldn't take it anymore, and they gave up. And the easiest way to kill yourself, they went over to the barbed wire and they electrified themselves.
While you were in Gross Rosen, you have there are a lot of stories, and we're skipping over some of them. This is your second time today already you're speaking. But there's one story in particular, a poignant story. You worked in a factory, and there was a rabbi there that you loved very much. At this point, you're alone. You're 14, 15 years old. Your father is gone. Your mother is gone. Your 10 siblings you don't know where they are. Ultimately, 200 additional family members of yours passed. You're by yourself. This rabbi was somebody who was special to you. Can you tell me a little bit about him and how he kept your spirits up?
Well, actually, it was in Camp Bolkenheim.
Okay.
We were transferred from Grossrosen to Bolkenheim. And we worked in an airplane factory. We were making parts for the Luftwaffe, for the German Air Force.
Which is something like this one, which was also a...
Yeah. And there was a rabbi from Hungary. I only know his first name. His name was Rabbi Yitzchak, a wonderful, wonderful man. He was in his early 50s. And he took a liking to me. And he worked with me in the same factory. And every Shabbat, he used to come over to the machine where I was working. And he used to say to me, he called me an endearing name. He said, Moshe, do you know what day is today? And I said, yes, Rabbi. Today is Shabbat. He says, let's pray together. Because we had a few minutes, like we stopped for a few minutes. So I used to pray with him. I remembered all the prayers by heart because I learned them yet at home. And this went on all the months that we were together. We worked 1 week a day shift and 1 week night shift. Every shift was 12 hours. And we were always together. One Saturday night, he came over to me and he says, Moshe, do you know what is tonight? I said, no, Rabbi, I don't. He said, tonight we say slichot. So he was standing near me and reciting with me slichot. Because slichot, I didn't know, it only comes like 1 week in the year, although little parts I knew, but especially the longer ones I didn't. And there's a beautiful, beautiful prayer there. It's called Ech Eftach Peh. How can I open up my mouth? And it describes the suffering of the Jewish people. And he cried terribly. He always lined up at the roll call in the third line because he was a certain height. And one day, I don't know why, he lined up in the first row. And the commandant of Bolkenheim, who was a ferocious Nazi, he knew that he is a rabbi. He walked over to him and he says loud, Herr Rabbiner, meaning Rabbi Sir, where is your God? And Rabbi Yitzchak motions to heaven that God is in heaven. And he started to scream at him, no, I am your God. I can do with you whatever I want. He threw him down on the ground, and with his boots, he was hitting him until he stopped moving. He ordered him to be taken out, and a few hours later, he died. That night, when we returned from work, the whole camp was talking about this because he was trying to encourage even the non-religious, and everybody had respect for him, and everybody was listening to him. And this discussion of where was God went on for weeks and weeks, every night when we came home from work. I, as a 15-year-old, then I was 15, was sitting on top of the third shelf, and I was listening because there were very learned people in the Jewish, among the Jewish prisoners, and they were bringing all kinds of quotes from the Bible, from the Talmud, from the Midrashim, from all over. But there were also some that said there could not be a God if he allows a thing like this. And this discussion went on. I wrote about it. In one of my books, I described these discussions and what was said. Of course, nobody has the exact answer, but those that have faith know that God wasn't hiding. And that's what tradition says.
When you saw this happen, without going into it, I also know that there were times where you personally were beaten, you were starving, you were alone. You must have had your own questions of faith. You also must have had points at which did you ever just want to say, I don't want to do this anymore? Was there ever a moment in your story before liberation when you said, I just want to die?
I had a very strong spirit. And this I attribute to my family. I learned that there is a God and that the Jewish people will go on living. And that you have to believe no matter what. There is a saying in the Talmud that even if the sharp knife is on your neck, you shouldn't give up hope. So, when I felt low, that I wanted to give up, I reminisced about home, about Shabbat, about the holidays, about how it was. And that gave me courage. Also, I felt that somebody has to survive of the family. And that was kept me going. There is a saying in Yiddish, a Mensch tracht und Gott lacht. That a person thinks that he knows everything, but God is laughing because he knows exactly what's going to happen to you. Now, there were times that I wanted to give up. There is another very beautiful saying in Yiddish. Ein Mensch ist starker von Eisen und schwacher von a Flieg. A human being is stronger than iron, but he is weaker than a fly. Many times I felt very strong spiritually, but I felt weak like a fly. And I tried to get together all my strength, and thank God I'm here.
There's one more part to your story before we get to liberation that's especially poignant, and that is the death march. You went to
Yes.
Buchenwald. At some point, the Germans realized that they weren't going to win. And this is something they did all over. If you Google search death march, you'll notice that there's lots of them because it wasn't just happening in one place. This was an organized effort by the German war machine to hurry up and finish what they clearly realized they were not going to be able to do in a systematized way. So they marched people out thousands and thousands at a time with no food, no water, no protection from the elements, and they literally walked them to death. Dr. Avital, you were part of a march. It started off with 10,000 people.
Right.
How many people were in your death march by the time you landed up in Buchenwald right before liberation?
Only 400 survived out of 10,000.
I'm not great at math. But if you were to do the math and the ratio, there are 400 people in this room. If it started off at 10 and you did the math, I would say these people right here, they have a 104 chance of surviving. Nobody else in the room would have made it, just to understand the ratio. So you marched for 5 weeks
Right,
in the snow.
right.
You were still wearing your clothing from Auschwitz. Did they give you coats?
No, it was the thin pajamas like that they gave us in Auschwitz, which was very thin and it was very cold, and we wore the wooden shoes.
And what was the weather like?
It was 20 below zero. The snow was coming down.
There was one particularly beautiful, hard story of heroism.
Yes,
Do you feel comfortable telling that story?
yes. While we were marching, the guards had orders that those that cannot keep up with the march, to shoot them and throw them to the side of the road. One of the guards gave his backpack to a prisoner to carry it for him. And a little while after that, the prisoner opened up the backpack and he saw that there is food. So he ate as much as he could and he gave it to the people around him and he threw away the backpack. After a while, the guard was looking for the prisoner, but he couldn't recognize him because all of us looked alike. We had the same uniforms. We were all emaciated. We were all covered with snow. Our eyes were sticking out because we were swollen from hunger. And he couldn't recognize him. So he went over to the commandant who was leading the column. And he told him what happened. And the commandant yelled out, "Whoever took the backpack, come forward." Nobody moved. Again, "Whoever took the backpack, come forward." Nobody moved. And then he says, if within 2 minutes the one who took the backpack doesn't come forward, every 10th prisoner is going to be shot. The 2 minutes were over, and they started to count, and they took out every 10th prisoner, and they lined them up. And just before they were going to start shooting those prisoners, a prisoner came forward and said, "I was the one who did it because I was very hungry." We never found out if it was the real prisoner or if it was a Jew who volunteered or sacrificed himself in order to save hundreds of prisoners. Now, these things happened many times in the camps. There's a saying in Hebrew, Kol Yisrael arevin zeh lazeh. One Jew is responsible for one another. You asked me before if people were nice to each other. Most of the time, the Jews were trying to help each other. But there were others that didn't. But in a case like that, here a Jew sacrificed himself in order to save these Jews.
The last camp you're in, the camp that you arrived at the end of your death march with 400 other people, was Buchenwald.
Right.
Buchenwald is notorious for many things. It had crematoria. It did terrible things to the people who were staying in it. On the other hand, it was interesting in that it allowed for people who were neither well enough to work sometimes, nor sick enough to exterminate, to linger between life and death. There was a barrack, famous barrack of children.
Right.
Elie Wiesel was in this barrack. You were in this barrack. Rabbi Lau, who is the chief rabbi of Israel for many years, was in this barrack. Right before liberation, the Germans knew that Death March didn't do it. We still have 60,000 people in this camp.
80,000.
80,000 people in this camp. What are we going to do with them? What they did was they would bring you out to the woods. They would line you up, and they would shoot you. If the Germans were nothing else, they were incredibly efficient. And I bring this up because I want to flip it on its ear and remind us that in 4 days, the Germans exterminated 60,000 people. That's a very hard number to wrap your head around. 6 million is also, but 60,000 people. I can't show you something that looks like 6 million people. But if you want to know what 60,000 people looks like, look at a good Seahawks game. That stadium holds 67,000 people at capacity. This is a game almost at capacity. This many people were shot in 4 days. What were you doing on Friday? Friday till today, this many people shot. And the one thing to remember is, if that only happens if you have a group of people who comes together and makes a conscious effort to do evil. Imagine what we can do in the same amount of time if we wanted to do good. Right?
Right.
Right before the end, or at the end, let's talk about the end. You're in a barrack. Your barrack is called out. Your barrack is brought to the forest. Who's leading your barrack, and what happens? How is it that you weren't shot?
On the 4th day that they emptied out all these barracks, came our turn, the children's barrack. The chief of the barrack was a Czech, a non-Jew, who was a wonderful person. He used to be a principal of a Czech public school. He was sent to Buchenwald because he was against the Germans. And he tried to help us as much as he could. He couldn't do a lot, but whatever he could, he did. Because all the other chief barracks, they were terrible, and he was a real wonderful person, like a father to us. So he tried to arrange for us to work, easier work. On the day that came our turn to be taken into the forest to be executed, he marched at the head of our barrack. And just before we reached the gate, the sirens started to wail, and the SS closed the gates, and they ran for cover. In the air appeared American bombers, and they started to bomb around the camp all the time for hours and hours until late at night. In the meantime, this chief barrack of the barrack told us to run back to our barrack. But most of us were very weak and couldn't run. I was very, very weak. I had to crawl on my stomach in order to get to the barrack. And I arrived there finally, and then it was quiet. All night it was quiet. In the morning, suddenly, 3 American tanks with 1 jeep broke through the gates, came into the camp, and that's how we were liberated. On the jeep was a Jewish chaplain by the name of Rabbi Herschel Schechter from Yeshiva University. He came into our barrack, the children's barrack, and he announced loud in Yiddish, Jiddische Kinder, ihr seid frei. Jewish children, you are free. That's how we were liberated.
Were you able to leave right away? Where were you when this was
No, I was so sick, they took me into a makeshift hospital, and I was for 2 months in the hospital because I was hovering between life and death. And the Americans really treated me so nice, and they fed me teaspoon by teaspoon of cereal, and they brought me back to life because there were some prisoners that after liberation, they grabbed all kinds of rich food, and some of them died because their stomach could not digest anymore. And since I was in the hospital, that helped me to survive.
Do you remember, I mean, you've been now years of hell, and the Americans come in, and we were talking about this, but this was often the sort of thing that they were seeing, dead people everywhere. Do you remember witnessing the first witnesses of the Shoah?
Yes, when the Americans came in, they were crying. They never saw something like it. They saw the dead bodies in the forest that they executed. They saw corpses lying outside the barracks, inside the barracks, and they said, you know, we saw a lot of our friends being killed, but that wasn't the war, but we never saw something like it. And Eisenhower came in a couple of days after liberation, and he ordered the photographers to take pictures because he said there will come a day when some people will deny that there was such a thing. Take the pictures so we can tell them and show them that what really happened.
You've said that liberation was both the happiest day and your saddest day.
Right.
Why is that?
It was the happiest day because the Germans were gone, and I felt, you know, that I have a chance for life. But it was the saddest day because I realized that I am alone, and I had no place to go because no country in Europe wanted to take in the survivors. I mean, we are talking now about immigration to America, 50,000, that many. Nobody wanted the Jews, especially, it's a matter of fact that in Poland, the Jews that came back from concentration camps, 1,500 survivors were killed after they came back to their towns because they wanted to get rid of them because they took away their properties and they were afraid that the Jews will take it back. So there was no place to go. The British were not allowed the Jews to go to Palestine. America didn't allow the Jews to come in then, only later. So it was one of those days. I had no birth certificate. I had no passport. I was a man without a country. So therefore,
it was sad. We're running out of time. There is so much more to say. I'm going to truncate just a little bit. After liberation, you were sent to southern France to recuperate.
right,
And from there, the Jewish Brigade, which was a brigade of people in Europe that was helping Jewish people to get to Palestine, came in, spoke to lots of the orphans that were convalescing in the same place you were. Out of the 600 people or so that were there, 400 of you all
signed
up to illegally run the English Brigade and go to Palestine. The
English blockade.
The English blockade, and enter Palestine illegally.
Right.
You get on a boat. The boat was renamed for the children.
Of Buchenwald.
There were how many people on this boat?
Since we collected from other ports also, in France and in Italy, we ended up having 1,100 teenagers, all of them survivors from the Holocaust.
Wow. And this is actually a picture of one of those boats with children on it that went to Palestine.
Right.
And you talk about you're in the boat, you actually have to hide underneath the boat because during the day the planes were going overhead to try to see if anybody was on the boat. At night you would come up. Were you're once again, you're in this cramped place, probably with rationed food. Did you care at this point? It must have felt completely different than being in a boxcar.
Even though food was rationed, water was rationed, we were like sardines, and during the day we had to be inside the ship. Only at night we were able to go out for fresh air. We were very happy because we knew we have a goal. We are going to our land of our fathers, and that we are going to start a new life. And then Suddenly, on the 10th day, when we saw from a distance the Carmel Mountains, 4 British Navy ships surrounded our ship, and they announced on the loudspeaker, "You are trying to get into Palestine illegally. Follow us." And they took us to Haifa, and in Haifa, they forcefully took us off the ship and took us by truck to the prisoner camp Atlit near Haifa. We were again prisoners. But at least we were not afraid that they're going to kill us. But we didn't know what their plans were.
And eventually, you were sprung out of jail, so to speak.
After 6 weeks in the camp, in the middle of the night, a Haganah unit tied up the British guards. They cut the barbed wire, and they took all of 1,100 of us out, loaded us on trucks, and distributed us in kibbutzim. In the morning, when the British discovered what happened, they declared curfew throughout the country. Thousands of British soldiers and police were looking for us, but they didn't find us. After 4 days, they gave up, and we were able to leave. And I myself joined the Haganah and fought in the Haganah and in the War of Liberation for 5 years.
You fought in the war. You were a decorated soldier. You came to America. You met your beautiful wife because you needed a ride to a wedding. This is a true story. You have 3 beautiful daughters. You have beautiful grandchildren, many of whom are here tonight. Thank you. I'm sorry. It was the 80s. It's cool, So much more to this story, and yet we're almost out of time.
Right.
And I know that for every survivor that we invite, I ask, you are here in front of the largest group of the largest event for young professionals ever. We are all record breakers here tonight, folks. What is it, if you could say something to this group to end this conversation this evening, what is it that you would say? And you wrote something down, and I would love if you could read it for us now.
Okay. I speak to you as one who miraculously emerged from the Holocaust, the kingdom of death. My knowledge of this dark chapter in human history derives from a direct, bitter personal experience. The memories of those days will remain with me until the end of my days. 1,200,000 human beings were murdered in Auschwitz. 1,100,000 Jews, 70,000 Poles, 25,000 Gypsies, and 15,000 Russian prisoners of war. This statistical data is a sobering reminder that the Holocaust is first and foremost a Jewish tragedy. More than 90% of the victims of Auschwitz were Jews. During the Holocaust, a total of 6 million Jews, among them 1.5 million Jewish children, were murdered throughout German-occupied Europe. We salute the righteous of the nations who risked their lives to save Jews. But why were there so few of them? After liberation from Buchenwald concentration camp, I felt loneliness and despair, especially when we saw that the world had not changed its attitude toward the Jewish people. No country wanted to welcome the survivors. England continued to hunt the ships which tried to bring survivors. The land of Israel to the Jewish homeland, like myself, only to be imprisoned by the British in Israel. Strength, dignity, and hope can take root even in the darkest of places. My story includes suffering along with stories of faith, hope, perseverance, and courage in the face of overwhelming odds and of never, ever giving up. It is our mission to transmit these memories and their implications to others, to those who were not there, in order to imbue within them the spirit of remembrance. It is our sacred duty to remind all who don't know, who don't want to know, and be disturbed by some memories. To all those distractors who try to deny or diminish our tragedy, we say, we are here to tell the tragic truth in full. We survivors carry with us the broken fragments of our people's past, the broken lives, the anguished deaths, for we refuse to let their deaths be in vain. Our families, communities, and our past lives on in us. As we continue the Jewish journey to the future, to hope and to life, the lost lives, the broken communities, the synagogues that were set on fire, the sacred scrolls burned and turned into ashes, the 1.5 million children, an entire generation. What our enemies killed, we keep alive in the only way we can, in our hearts and minds, in our memories, and in our memorial prayers. There are cultures that forget their past, and there are cultures that are held captive by the past. We do neither. We carry the past with us, as we will carry the memory of the Shoah with us as long as the Jewish people exist. Those fragments of memory help make us who we are. We live for what they died for. We walk tall as Jews, refusing to be intimidated by the anti-Semites. But this time, it is much different. We have the state of Israel. On the 72nd anniversary of the liberation of the concentration camps, we say to the souls of our people murdered in Europe's dark night, we will never forget you. We will not cease to mourn you. We will not let you down until the Jews can walk the world without fear. We will be witnesses to the God of life who told us, Uvacharta b'chaim, choose life against those who chose death. From the depths of destruction, we survivors brought forth a new spirit to rebuild our lives, to establish families, to raise a wonderful generation of children and grandchildren, the living bridge between our past and our future. We have instilled in them pride of our heritage. They are the links in our broken chain of the Jewish people. My deepest appreciation and gratitude to the glorious United States Armed Forces, to their dedication and sacrifices they endured during the crusade to free Europe from the evil forces which ultimately led to the defeat of the Germans, their allies, and their collaborators. The Jewish people have a long memory and will never forget America's noble and humane actions. I am also very grateful to America for the refuge and haven I was given in this country. It enabled me to rebuild my life and establish a loving family. In conclusion, I would like to say 2 major events in our time drastically changed the course of Jewish history: the Holocaust, the destruction of European Jewry, with its rich cultural and spiritual creations. The second one, the restoration of Jewish independence in the land of Israel and the ingathering of the exiles after 2,000 years. One cannot understand Jewish life today without a thorough knowledge of these 2 events. I was part of these 2 events. For the first one, I paid a heavy price. I lost 14 precious souls of my immediate family and 200 of my extended family. In the second one, I am proud to have participated in the War of Independence and as a member of the Haganah. In Auschwitz and other concentration camps, the Germans had a slogan, Arbeit macht frei. We survivors say, Am Yisrael Chai, the Jewish people go on living. Thank you.